So under the pay reparations and investment in community repair and reinvestment, who does this include specifically, and what direction would you take to implement this?
Yeah, so I just did a whole show yesterday about this on Black Liberation Media about our response to Wes Moore vetoing the Maryland Reparations Commission that happened last
Mhm.
week. So I imagine most of your viewers are aware of this, but there was a bill that came out of the Maryland House and the Maryland Senate that would have created a 2-year commission in order to study reparations in the state of Maryland. It was not mostly focused on the question of whether they were due, but was focused on what to do. Wes Moore vetoed it, I think to the shock of some people, not to my surprise that much. So what our policy would do is a couple of things. The first thing would be that we would expand on the community repair and reinvestment funds that came out of the Cannabis Reform Act of 2023. So in 2023, when recreational cannabis came into Maryland, they created this fund where a chunk, 35%, I think originally, of recreational cannabis tax receipts would go to um, the jurisdictions that had the most arrests during the war on drugs. And then each of those jurisdictions is responsible for setting up a local commission that allocates the funds as they see fit. We think this is a good program. We think it works. We think it's getting off the ground, and we think additional revenue should go into that. So that's one thing. The second thing is we absolutely believe that there should be some form of cash payment reparations for different people who have been harmed by racist state policy. That includes people who were enslaved in the state of Maryland, but that also includes people who were forced to attend segregated schools that were underfunded by the state of Maryland. That includes people who were subject to legalized discrimination during Jim Crow. That includes people whose homes and communities were redlined, a practice that started here in Baltimore. And that includes probably people whose communities were destroyed and targeted by the war on drugs. It also includes a focus on cemeteries and sacred spaces, because we've been working very closely with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, which is a group of people who are trying to defend the burial ground of a free Black community in Maryland that got taken by the county and developers, and stuff was built on top of their cemetery.
So good to see you, and so good to have you on the channel.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to have an opportunity to have this conversation today, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much for coming on. And so you're running for, Maryland governor against the likes of Wes Moore. And just one of the questions I had is, why did you decide to run?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been a member of the Green Party since about 2015. After Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, I looked around and I understood that the two parties that we had, or really the one party that we have here in Baltimore, was not going to be capable of the kind of change that we needed in order to stop more Freddie Grays from being killed. So I got involved with the Green Party. I've been voting Green for a while, but I got involved at that point heavily. In the state of Maryland, the governor's race is one of the races that if we get 1% in it, we're able to have ballot access for the next year's race. So it's always been something that we've paid attention to. We've always looked at the governor's race and the president's race, because if we get 1% in those races, we can get ballot access without having to petition. But it wasn't just a functional decision. I think the politics of the state of Maryland, where the Democrats rule almost everything that happens in state government and have done so since 1866, vastly need a third-party voice, a multi-party voice, and one of those third parties to be like the Green Party, rooted in grassroots politics, justice, peace, democracy, and ecology. And so I looked at our 2022 candidate, Nancy Wallace, who ran, and she did not get started until like July or August of 2022, but she still was able to get really close to that 1%. And so I said, look, if we can run a 4-year campaign that is really good and that is really dedicated to building the Green Party across the state, not only can we get that 1%, but we can, start to build a third party politics that changes outcomes in the state of Maryland beyond just giving people more choices. So the day after Election Day in 2022, I, declared that I was exploring. January of this year, I declared that I was running, and here we are.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. So I do have a few questions. And first, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to your policy platform here because I would like to see everybody to see what it is. So here is your website. It is gogreen2026.com that you have here for governor. And of course, anybody who comes here, they have, all the different parts, especially, one talking about how you have a petition so that you guys can also enter the debates, which I also think is very important. You guys should be able to debate, especially on these issues that are so important. And also, you also have a podcast as well, which is great to be able to get that a fireside chat, as it were, out to the people. So I do think that is also very important. But one of the things I want to do is I want to go to the priorities. And so the priorities here are really your platform so far to what I've seen, as far as what I've been looking at. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to start from the bottom and I'm going to work my way up, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And so we'll be doing that. And so it could be kind of in reverse order. So I think it will be very interesting to go that route. So just let me get to my notes here. Let me see. So as far as the first question goes, is under the build reliable and accessible mass transit all over Maryland, what would this look like and how will you pay for it? And does this include incorporating high-speed rail throughout the state? And what about assisting local municipalities with their public transit issues?
Yeah. So, I mean, Maryland right now, Maryland is a place that is pretty dependent on roads and highways, and is a place that used to be very dependent on rail. So, if we look back like 100 years, 50 years or so, rail was running all over the state. You could get from Western Maryland to Baltimore and DC very easily. Interstate highways came and replaced that. Suburbanization came and replaced that. And the rail is now mostly, more freight rail and that type of thing. So one of the things is that we need to make sure not just that the urban areas and the suburban areas have good transit, but that the folks out in Western Maryland and on the Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland have access to all parts of the state without having to sit in traffic forever. There's a place that we've been going a lot in Western Maryland, in a place called Cumberland. Cumberland used to be the second largest city in the state of Maryland. It is in Appalachia, and it was where resources came from Appalachia to go down to DC and go down to Baltimore to get processed and exported and all of that. So it was a big part of the industrial economy. There was rail lines that went from Cumberland to Baltimore, rail lines that went from Cumberland to DC. Industry left, highways replaced rail. Now Cumberland has decreased in size drastically, and the only businesses in Cumberland are big hospitals and prisons. And so the folks who used to live in this sort of thriving Appalachian industrial town no longer have really any business, and they're trapped there unless they have a car that can get on the highway and drive several miles a day. So when we think about what transit looks like, it's not just a question of making sure that it is well maintained in the urban areas. That is important, but it is not just that. It's also re-extending rail lines across the state. So how do we pay for it? That's going to be a good question. We're going to have to figure out how to use tax dollars, how to use special transportation funds, and use a variety of these things to do that. But we have to prioritize it, and then we have to figure out how to pay for it. And so there's no sort of magic formula that is like we'll do this. But I think we have to make it a top priority to have transit to go to those places. And part of the reason that transit doesn't go to those places right now is because those places vote Republican reliably, and the General Assembly in Maryland has been controlled by Democrats since 1866. So they don't have a lot of interest in, making sure that that's a budgetary priority. If there's a Republican governor who's in office, they don't have a lot of interest in making sure mass transit is an option. So even when you have governors who care about that part of the state, they care about building highways to that part of the state. So we need a governor that cares about making sure that the people outside of the suburban area and urban areas have transit. Now, that being said, we also need to focus. I live in Baltimore, and Baltimore has a sort of truncated subway line that started to get built. And so a lot of our transit is bus in the city, and it's okay, but it is not on scale with a city the size of Baltimore. And it's really hard to get east or west. It's really hard for the Black working class neighborhoods to get to the places where jobs are. And it's really in a lot of the suburban areas that have the office parks, that have the retail, all of that. They don't want West and East Baltimore come into their communities. So we have to also make sure that that last mile transit type of thing is available for folks so that when they do get on the existing transit, they can get to the job that's 2 miles away from the bus stop or 2 miles away from the subway station.
Okay. So one thing I would like to follow up with is in regards to paying for it, because you get a lot of people who are going to go, well, what are you going to do? You're going to tax the job creators, things like that. One thing that I am aware of that's a way around that, especially because a lot of times when it comes to raising taxes, sometimes they'll be raising taxes on the working class and some who are on the upper echelons of the working class. A way around that is from what I know is called public banks. Are you aware of the Public Bank of North Dakota?
Yeah, absolutely. And public banking is a big part of what our platform is going to be. So, like when we talk about solidarity economy, I think that's on the list as well. That focuses on
Okay.
public banks, that focuses on cooperatives, that focuses on
Okay.
progressive taxation,
Okay.
and it focuses on making polluters pay and that type of thing as well. So,
Okay.
CSX, who controls a lot of the rail lines going west right now, um,
Mhm.
I think owes a lot to the state of Maryland based on the pollution that they've put into the state of Maryland, based on the damage
Yeah.
they've done there. So yeah, a combination of public banks, a combination of progressive taxation, and making polluters who happen to run the rail lines and on the rail lines pay for the damage they've done in the state of Maryland.
Yeah, just so that people can see, I actually have this infographic, and Andy, I can always share it with you as well. But this is actually talking about the different types of banks, including the public bank and what it would mean. This is from the publicbankinginstitute.org, and it shows all the different types of depositories that exist and how they are and how they differ between a public bank. So you have a public bank, credit unions, global banks, community banks, different financing authorities, things like that. So this actually shows about how public banks work and how would they institute financing for infrastructure. And this is a great way of doing it without having to raise taxes at all. Now, I'm of the opinion, personally, that we should do this and raise taxes on the most wealthy. I think it's almost like a 1-2 punch, right? Because then if you're raising taxes on the wealthy, that also can contribute to the wealth building that a public bank can do, so that you can actually implement more infrastructure projects throughout the state, especially in regards to public transportation. And I just have one more follow-up question in regards to this, if you don't mind. Would you be willing to speak with governments that implement things like high-speed rail? This would be governments in Europe. This will be Japanese government. This would be the Chinese government. Would you be willing to have conversations with them to see how you can implement this in a cost-effective, but also a very widespread way throughout the state of Maryland?
Yeah, totally. One of a couple of things. So one of the core tenets of the campaign is that we'll talk to anybody. So if
Mhm.
there's anybody who has advice or criticism about what we're saying, we want to talk to them. We want to have those conversations. We think that too often politics in the blue party and the red party, they only talk to the people they want to, and they only hear from the people that they care to hear from. And we think that that is something that needs to be broken down. So absolutely, if there's anybody who wants to talk about any of those things, please let us know. Second thing I will say is if folks want to check out a really good podcast about public banking and how it helps solidarity economy, there's an episode in there with a guy named Matt Stannard. Matt Stannard used to work for the Public Banking Institute, and he
Okay.
shares some lessons of why we need to have a progressive and leftist worker focused politics while we're implementing public banking so that it doesn't just become a sort of tool. Like his sort of position is, as a tool by itself, it doesn't solve the problems if you don't have the right politics behind using the tool.
All right. Beautiful. Thank you so very much for that. So we're
Sure.
going to move on to the next point that I want to get to. Let's see here. All right. So the next one after that about mass transit, we're going into our next question. And so this one is the ensure education is a public good. So according to the worldpopulationreview.com, Maryland ranks number 12 in the nation for education in 2024, but ranked 10th in school funding and resources. What are some ways in which you will increase education standards in the state, especially for underserved areas like Westover, which has 59% Black population, Upper Marlboro that has almost 74% Black population, or Baltimore that has a 61% Black population? And by the
Yes.
way, all these districts have either a C minus or C plus grading in school districts.
Yes, a great question. A couple of things. So, Maryland instituted a program called the Blueprint for Education Reform a couple of years ago, and it was a $30 billion commitment over 10 years to increase public education in the state of Maryland. I think that the amount of money that it spends is pretty good, but a lot of it is so prescriptive about what it requires schools to do that it doesn't allow them to do things that are already working for them in some cases. So it requires that they, have this type of program and they have that type of program and they have something else. Um, and and it is so top-down prescriptive that it takes away the ability of local jurisdictions, of local teachers, and of local, of communities to be able to dictate a lot of these things. So, and I say this as a person. I used to work in Baltimore City Schools as a debate coach. I ran the middle school urban debate league program from 2005 until about 2007, and that program was funded by the city school system, and it went into the 14 middle schools that No Child Left Behind had deemed persistently dangerous in Baltimore City. And it was part of a larger program that helped teach debate to students across high schools in the area. So I spent a decent amount of time in the schools. And I think that in every school, in every community, there are teachers, there are parents, there are students, and there is community that understands what needs to happen in those schools. But they need the flexibility in order to be able to implement the solutions that work for them. And I think one of the problems that I have with the blueprint is not the funding, which is the problem the Republicans have with it, but the prescriptiveness, which takes away the ability of the local jurisdictions to make their decisions. So I think one of the key things that Greens push on almost every instance is decentralization. And in a state like Maryland, that means pushing out curriculum, professional development, extracurricular, and all of those things as much as we can to the local jurisdictions instead of having the State Board of Education try to determine what is right for everybody. So I think that looks like making sure that the people who know what they need to do have the resources in order to do it instead of forcing them to do a checklist or a checkbox or whatever. Now, the other thing about this is that it has to have there has to be progressive taxation involved in this. There has to be community colleges involved in this as well. Community colleges are involved in it right now. But again, it's pretty prescriptive. They have to offer certain programs. They have to do this. They have to do the other. And I think, community colleges are a significant resource for a lot of workers, for a lot of immigrants, for a lot of folks. And we need to give them the autonomy and the resources as well to do what they know works. This doesn't mean people shouldn't have standards, but it does mean that they should have less prescriptive dictates and less 10-year plans being passed down from the state bureaucrats and let more teachers, school boards, student members of school boards, communities determine what's going to go on in communities.
So, in regards to that question as well, because I want to get into this too. One of my questions to follow up with this is, what about having a bigger push to have more vocational trade school education in the state to help build up your infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think Baltimore City has these trade school and vocation programs they've had for a long time. Sometimes they work with the unions in order to collaborate and cooperate on things. I think we need to expand those type of things. I think we need to make sure that there are apprentice programs in those things that allow folks to get out of school and move right into a job. Baltimore is a working class city, and it has always been a working class city. And the emphasis that has come over the last couple of decades that everybody has to go to college, et cetera, doesn't match with the way that Baltimore was when it was at its highest levels of success, where people were working industrial jobs and things like that. So, I mean, I think that stuff needs to be invested in, that stuff needs to be expanded in. Community colleges are a really good resource for that type of thing as well. Unions should be part of that. And a couple of years ago, we worked on this pilot program that would have taught students at Baltimore City schools to do solar panel installation, to do all geothermal installation and that type of thing. And the idea was that they could, at the same time they were learning, help to install that structure on city school buildings and things like that. Now, there's some infrastructure questions. Are the roofs in good enough shape? But the state is investing a lot of money in upgrading Baltimore City schools, and we'd like to see something like that happen. It didn't take off when we were proposing it before. There didn't seem to be interest amongst Democrats who were in elected office about it. But that's the type of thing that I would love to see is, teaching people trades that are going to be useful for the future, and teaching people trades that make a real difference right now. And that has to be a cooperation between the state, the county, the schools, the unions, the whatever industry there is, and the community colleges.
Yeah, because one of the reasons why I asked, because a lot of the trades people who are working in these trades now, there has been such a lax in education and vocational and trade schools that they are a lot of these trades people who are workers there. They're going up in age, and now they're starting to age out and retire out of these fields. But there's really not too as many people to replace them as there should be. And so now we're going to be running into a huge deficit. And this could be people like welders, carpenters, plumbers, it could be masons, it could be many different types of electricians, it could be many different types of fields within this. And so it feels like we're going to be running into a massive deficit within the next 10 to 15 years, because a lot of people who are in these fields are going to be retiring, fairly soon. So that's what.
Absolutely. And like I said, Baltimore, where I live, is a working class city. And that is that when it has been at its best, has been when it has had a strong working class, when the trades have been strong. And so I think across the state, these type of programs are really important. And again, they got to be a collaboration between the trades, the schools, and the community colleges, and whoever else is willing to participate to make it work.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So we're going to be moving on to our third question from the bottom up. So this one has to deal with reparations, and this one is something that you have been spearheading very strongly. So under the pay reparations and investment in community repair and reinvestment, who does this include specifically, and what direction would you take to implement this?
Yeah, so I just did a whole show yesterday about this on Black Liberation Media about our response to Westmore vetoing the Maryland Reparations Commission that happened last
Mhm.
week. So I imagine most of your viewers are aware of this, but there was a bill that came out of the Maryland House and the Maryland Senate that would have created a 2-year commission in order to study reparations in the state of Maryland. It was not mostly focused on the question of whether they were due, but was focused on what to do. Westmore vetoed it, I think to the shock of some people, not to my surprise that much. So what our policy would do is a couple of things. The first thing would be that we would expand on the community repair and reinvestment funds that came out of the Cannabis Reform Act of 2023. So in 2023, when recreational cannabis came into Maryland, they created this fund where a chunk, 35%, I think originally, of recreational cannabis tax receipts would go to um, the jurisdictions that had the most arrests during the war on drugs. And then each of those jurisdictions is responsible for setting up a local commission that allocates the funds as they see fit. We think this is a good program. We think it works. We think it's getting off the ground. And we think additional revenue should go into that. So that's one thing. The second thing is we absolutely believe that there should be some form of cash payment reparations for different people who have been harmed by racist state policy. That includes people who were enslaved in the state of Maryland, but that also includes people who were forced to attend segregated schools that were underfunded by the state of Maryland. That includes people who were subject to legalized discrimination during Jim Crow. That includes people whose homes and communities were redlined, a practice that started here in Baltimore. And that includes probably people whose communities were destroyed and targeted by the war on drugs. It also includes a focus on cemeteries and sacred spaces, because we've been working very closely with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, which is a group of people who are trying to defend the burial ground of a free Black community in Maryland that got taken by the county and developers, and stuff was built on top of their cemetery. And you know, we do think a commission is necessary. We think a commission is necessary to understand the details about how state policy can figure out what to do in order to pay reparations, how to calculate the individuals that have actuarial claims, and that type of thing. And we also think that that commission should not be a state agency, because if we made it a state agency right now, we would be turning that agency basically over to the Democratic Party in the state of Maryland. And we don't trust the Democratic Party as much as we trust the sort of independent Black scholars, activists, community organizations, HBCUs. You know, there's a really strong civic society of Black folks here in Maryland. And I think we would rather see the commission made up of folks like that, that are not, you know, under the control of whoever the governor and the General Assembly is, who, until some change happens, is likely to be members of the Democratic Party. So we could talk all day about reparations. Let me stop there and see if that answers the question you had, or if there's more specificity you want from me.
Well, one of the reasons why I asked about more specifically is because some people, they think that reparations is specifically a race-based repair, and versus others who say it is more based on lineage and status. What is your opinion based on that?
Yeah, I believe that reparations is about classes of people who were wronged by state policy or by private institutions and things like that. So I do not see it as a race-based policy. And it's not all, it's somewhere between race-based and lineage, I think. You know, I think there's some people who have, no, actually, let me go back to that. It's not a race-based policy. It is about people and communities who were directly affected by racist policy, at least at the state level. I think the Democratic Party's approach to this, approach to racial wealth and racial health gaps and racial whatever other gaps, are a sort of combination of poverty reduction and affirmative action. And I think that's what Wes Moore is defending when he defends his record on these things as it relates to closing the wealth gap. We think that it is about repairing damage that was done to people, to communities, et cetera. And I think that includes the descendants of those people who have a lineage-based connection. So if somebody was enslaved in the state of Maryland, and their ancestors and people who have a lineage connection to them are here in the state of Maryland, they should be eligible for some form of reparation. If people who left the state of Maryland because racial terror pushed them out of the state of Maryland, but they were either enslaved or subject to segregated schooling or legalized discrimination or redlining, they should be able to come back and get that reparation. And so for me, it is comprehensive. There are communities that were really specifically damaged by racist policy. those type of things are best served by something like a community repair and reinvestment fund. There were individuals who were harmed by racist policy, and it has had long-lasting effects on their descendants and on the people who come after them. Those folks should be eligible for cash and other forms of monetary compensation. There are sites like the Moses Macedonia Cemetery that have been desecrated and destroyed in a different way. They should also be eligible for a kind of reparation that allows the descendants to have access to control of the land, control of the narrative, and any resources they need to restore their connection to the place where their loved ones are buried.
Yeah, the reason why I ask about the race-based versus lineage and status-based is because there are some people who think that it is based strictly on race, when in reality it is a status issue. Like for instance, if you have somebody that has either first generation or second generation immigrants from, say, they could be from Nigeria, or they could be from the Bahamas, or they could be from Jamaica, they wouldn't be entitled to those reparations because because even though they're entitled to reparations, it wouldn't be from the United States government. It would be from the governments that enslaved their people from other countries. And so, like for instance, somebody who is of Jamaican descent would be demanding reparations from England, not the United States. And so, of course, we stand with those who demand reparations as well. Like for instance, the Haitian people, they definitely deserve reparations from France, but they wouldn't get it from the United States because their descendants weren't enslaved by the United States. And so that's why we say it's a status and lineage based, not a race based. And so you'll even have people that may even be white passing, but because they have that lineage of being freedmen or African descendants of slaves, then of course they would receive those reparations as well. And a lot of times, people would probably be up in arms and thinking, oh, well, it's all race based. And it's like, no, it's lineage and status based. It is not based on race. And then on top of it, of course, people will try to combat it by saying, well, that's race based, that's racism in regards to, like, the 14th Amendment and whatnot. And so, of course, this is why we have to base it legally on status and lineage.
Right. And look, I'll put it this way. Like, if there is a person who is a Jamaican immigrant who lived in a neighborhood that was redlined and it destroyed the value of their family's home, they qualify because they're in the class of people who were redlined, right? Like, and that's not going to happen that much, right? Because most of the redlined neighborhoods were people who came out of, who had lineage-based connections to folks who had been enslaved. They may not have been enslaved in the state of Maryland. They may not have been, but that they are a class of people who was subject to racist policy. To me, it's not about race; it's about racist policy. And if there is explicitly racist policy, like by the state of Maryland, or or by the counties in Maryland, or by businesses that were colluding with the state and the counties, those folks, I think, are eligible for some repair from the state. I think some of the conversation is a little bit different at the federal level, but I think at the state, it gets real precise. And it's really easy to say, this house that these people lived in had red lines drawn around it, and that decreased the value of their home, and that decreased the value of the home that they could pass on to people for generations. And that there should be an actuarial way to look at the damage that was done and figure out how to compensate them or their descendants for that. So, I think it is not like, does it apply to immigrants or does it apply to folks who were enslaved? It is, if you are in a class of people who are in one of the things that is eligible for reparations at the state level, then we believe that should be calculated. I think most of this is designed to speak to folks who will be, I think most of my policy is designed to speak to people who have lineage-based connections to enslavement in the United States. But I'm not going to exclude, say a Jamaican immigrant moved here in 1945, they moved to the Baltimore City, and the banks and the state drew a red line around their home and decreased the value of it. Fine, they should file a claim and they should be eligible for that. Does that make sense?
I see where you're going with that. The thing is that it would be based on just more than just redlining. So it'll be a combination of redlining, Jim Crow, chattel slavery, things like that. And so
Yep.
for somebody that's maybe a black immigrant, I think it would be based on like the racial justice policy, which should be kind of separate from the reparations policy. So if you want to do like a racial justice policy that focuses on, the entirety of people who are marginalized, black and brown and whatnot, I think that's fine. But as far as the reparations itself, I think that that should be for people who are descendants of slaves that were from the United States.
No.
So I'm not saying that they shouldn't get any type of compensation, but in regards to the conversation about reparations, I think it should be from freedmen, and not other groups that are in company with it. I put it like this: for the people who are Japanese who are interned, Koreans are not going to be getting those reparations. Vietnamese aren't going to be getting those reparations. Chinese aren't going to be getting those reparations. It's going to be just Japanese,
The
right?
people who were in a class of people who were interned by racist policy, right? And look, I mean, a person who was enslaved in the state of Maryland, a person who had to who's has a lineage connection to people who were enslaved, a person who has a lineage connection to a person who was forced to attend a segregated, underfunded school, a person that
Mhm.
has a lineage connection to somebody who went to Jim Crow, and a person who went through Jim Crow, and a person who has a lineage connection to somebody to a community that was redlined is probably going to get more is going to be eligible for more cash payment in the state of Maryland than they would somebody who just lived in a redline community but moved to the United States in 1950 or something like that. So to me, it's a question of degree, right? To me, reparations like are a policy framework to remediate and solve past injustices that the government took part in. And in Maryland, that's particularly important because Maryland was a northern state that had 87,000 people enslaved at the beginning of the Civil War. It was not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not subject to the federal Reconstruction. It didn't really have a ton of Freedmen's Bureau activity here. And again, by 1866, Democrats had retaken control of the state legislature, and they re-enfranchised former Confederates, former slave owners, and folks like that. So while the rest of the Deep South and the rest of the Confederate states were going through this period where, um, you know, um, freedmen had some freedom, enjoyed some prosperity, a little bit. Maryland, that wasn't happening. Maryland, that wasn't happening because the slave owners took power back by 1866 and haven't given it up. The Democratic Party hasn't given it up since then. And so I think it's a little bit different here than it is in the national context because of that. And so that time from 1866 to 1877, when Maryland was doing its own self-reconstruction, there were apprenticeship programs that were sending freed people's children back to the plantations that they had once worked for. There was a beginning of a whole bunch of unequal access and there's a book that I've been reading called The Road to Jim Crow that talks about how Southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore of Maryland in that time period from 1860 to 1877 were really laying the groundwork for what became Jim Crow later on, because they had, I guess I would say like Maryland went through its redemption phase 1 year after the war, and so that created a lot of conditions that allowed things like Jim Crow to develop very strong in those places, that allowed legalized segregation to occur. Through much of the 1870s, there were segregated schools in the state of Maryland, but there were no funding for Black schools. So there were whole counties and whole regions where Black folks weren't able to go to high school in the 1860s and the 1870s because the state wasn't funding it, even though it was requiring separate schooling systems. Maryland is the place where redlining started. Baltimore is the place where redlining started. So I hear what you're saying, and I think what I'm saying is that like we need to have a contextual state level policy that understands the damage that the state of Maryland has done via racist policy. And if we can identify classes of people who were subject, classes of people, mostly American descendants of slavery, mostly whatever group name you want to do attached to that, that's what most of those folks are going to be. But like because Maryland was trying to curtail the freedom and liberty of those folks for a very long time, and so for me, It is about coming up with a reparative policy that allows to understand the legacy of Maryland's history past enslavement, and then figuring out what reparations are necessary in order to be able to allow each of the people in those classes to have some repair and have the state do some reckoning and have those people have some repair.
All right. Thank you very much for that nuanced answer. Let's move on to question number 4. Let's go into that one. It says, under protect the most vulnerable, who would this include and who are to you are the most vulnerable?
Well, first of all, I think Black folks in this state, there's a lot of people that live in hyper segregated places right now that are subject
Yeah.
to over policed neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And, like East and West Baltimore are incredibly over policed and incredibly unsafe. That's driven down home values, that's driven down job prospects, and that kills a lot of people. And so that would be one group. I think immigrants in Maryland are also relatively vulnerable at this point because we have 6 or 7 counties where sheriffs have 287G agreements with ICE, and so MAGA sheriffs are rounding up immigrants and putting them into a deportation pipeline. There was a bill in the Maryland General Assembly this year that would have ended those agreements, and the Democratic president of the Senate, in a backroom deal, killed it at the last minute because the governor didn't want to sign it. So I think that's one group. I think I think you know queer LGBT folks are also very vulnerable at this point because of the national politics around that. I think are targeting especially trans folks at this moment, and I think we need to make sure that there are protections for those folks, and not like focused on sports and that type of thing, but focused on homelessness, focused on healthcare, focused on what is happening within the criminal justice system. I think those are the places where I want to have the conversations about what we do with LGBT communities, is how to make sure that those folks have homes, that they have health care, that they have access to housing, and that they are not subject to abuse by the criminal justice system. I also think there's a lot of rural folks in this state who are entirely left out of the suburban and urban vision of the Democrats who run the state. And it's we saw recently that there was some really bad flooding in Western Maryland and really bad flooding in an Appalachian part of the state. There's a pledge to help rebuild, and there's a pledge to create community funds and things like that. But I think we need to do something like figure out an Appalachian mutual aid network and an Appalachian network amongst different states in the area, so that when there's a flood in Maryland, folks from West Virginia can help out, folks from Pennsylvania can help out, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of folks in this state that are vulnerable. And Maryland projects itself as a state that is very wealthy, very well off, and everybody here does well. And that is true for the people for whom it's true. But there's a lot of folks who aren't wealthy, who are subject to some of the most aggressive police in the country, that are subject to, problems with MAGA sheriffs running deportation pipelines. So there's a lot of folks, I think, that are vulnerable, even though Maryland is one of the richest states in the country.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't include people who are disabled and
Yep.
neurodivergent as well. A
Yep.
lot
No.
of times they are also subject to brutality by police as well within the states. It's just terrible, especially if somebody's having a mental health episode and they send police to take care of a mental health episode, and then that person either winds up either being subject to police brutality or wind up being murdered by police because they're experiencing a mental health episode. So I think that
Yep.
they are also one of the big groups too.
And I apologize for not including that. There's a whole lot of folks that are
Yeah,
vulnerable in the state of Maryland, and if we look at what is happening in school discipline and school punishment and things like
yeah,
that, students who are Black or who are disabled in one way or another, the combination of those two things increases the likelihood that those students face really harsh discipline, and increases the likelihood that those students get sentenced if they do get involved in the criminal justice system.
yeah,
And so I think all of these systems are interconnected to each other.
of
Um,
course.
in a state that prides itself on its sort of liberal, progressive, upper middle class tax base and what they're able to achieve, has a lot of blind spots and a lot of things that it misses and a lot of people it leaves behind.
Yep, definitely, definitely. Thank you very much for clarifying. Appreciate it very much. So let's go on number 5. All right. At least I got to the top 5. Man, I'm glad. Okay. So this was a big one. It says establish healthcare and housing as human rights. So what specifically would your plan be to guarantee healthcare to all Marylanders? And how would you fund and institute housing for all?
Yep. So, as far as healthcare goes, there was a bill this year called the Healthy Maryland Bill that would have studied what it needed to do in order to implement a single-payer healthcare system in the state of Maryland, at the state level. I know that state level healthcare or state level single payer is not the best way to go, but at this point, I think it is worth, especially in a state with a higher tax, with a higher tax base, to be able to explore it and to be able to put it into place. So I would push forward a bill that studied that, figured out the ways to pay for it, figured out the ways to deal with the Medicaid. Housing as a human right, to me, is a first step to guaranteeing that we have housing for everybody right now. I don't know that we can just sort of say, snap, there's going to be housing for everybody. But
Sure.
right now, in the state of Maryland, landlords tend to have more rights than renters. Developers tend to have more influence than homeowners. So I think by passing a constitutional amendment that says housing is a human right guaranteed in the state of Maryland, we change the parameters of the debate that is occurring about housing, and we take away power from some of the developers, from some of the corporate landlords, and from the counties who are almost always willing to make policy to defer to those folks. And I think once we change the nature of that debate, then courts are going to uphold a different set of laws. Courts are going to uphold a different set of policies and things like that. So I think the first step is enshrining it in the Constitution as a right that Marylanders have. And then the second step is using that as a foundation in order to develop policy that makes sure that people have more access to housing across the state. Now, some of this is also like, we need to encourage housing co-ops. We need to encourage land banks. We need to encourage some of these innovations that have been occurring right now. But oftentimes those things are running into legal trouble. They're running into the ability, they're not able to negotiate on the same terms with the big corporate landlords and things like that. And we're also seeing things where there's Democratic leaders in the House and the Senate that either want to allow there to be rent stabilization or good cause eviction, but not both. And I think we need to have a constitution that sets this out as a human right so that it's easier to be able to change the parameters of the debate so that we could have both of those things. There's no, there's no money tree, right? So we're not the federal government. We can't print money. We can't cut the military budget in half. So what we need to do is change the legal and policy and political parameters so it makes it easier for the people who are trying to offer the solutions in order to be able to win in the court of public opinion and be able to win in court of law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just a question, would this include trying to implement more of a direct citizen ballot initiative within the state? Because sometimes I feel like it is better to circumvent the politicians and do direct democracy in order to do this. And this could include a law to decommodify housing, especially if you can decommodify housing, at least half of housing. Of course, this will be a boom to some of those who are, who do have homes, where if you take 50% of the houses out of the market for being commodified, well, then they actually can grow in wealth, as far as their housing costs are concerned. But then at the same time, you decommodify it so you can actually provide housing for those who are unhoused. And so then there's not this huge influx of people who are unhoused who go, well, where do I go? Because one of the things that I notice is that a lot of times it's like a cycle. It's like once you are unhoused, then your health gets worse, or you become unhoused because your health got worse. Yep. Right. And so it's this perpetual cycle that ends up happening. And when I say health, I'm not just talking about physical health. I'm also talking about mental and emotional health as well, which can also lead to abuse of substances and things like that. A lot of people don't realize that some people become addicted to substances after they become homeless because they're homeless. right? Or sometimes, people have more, the mental health issues are exacerbated by being unhoused. And so really, I'm a firm believer in the housing first initiative, basically meaning you give people housing first, then you see, their conditions improve once they have a roof over their head, because that disease of despair is no longer there, meaning that the cortisol levels are dropping. And then because they have housing, they're more comfortable. They're able to use their more logical brain a little bit better. So then they're able to go, oh, I don't have much to do, even though I have a housing over me now. Let me do something, so like getting employment. Let me seek out help so that I can, curtail this substance abuse through, because substance abuse is a medical issue. Or if I'm having mental health issues, of course, adding the healthcare for all for everybody, so that they can also have mental health services without having to worry about cost. So then this also helps. It's almost like a domino effect, a positive domino effect that can happen as well.
Yes, totally. So if Roger is watching, he has been talking to me a lot about citizen initiative, and that absolutely is an important thing that we need to do here, because we don't have it at the state level. We have it in 14 counties where we can make charter amendments, and we can change the county level governance structure that way, but we don't have it at the state level. So if I were to be governor, I would demand that the General Assembly pass a constitutional amendment that allowed there to be citizen initiative, and I wouldn't veto anything that they sent my way if they didn't pass that, right? And and I'm not even saying that they would have to. I'm not even saying that they would have to institute citizen initiative. I'm saying they would have to give the voters of the state of Maryland an opportunity to get to vote on a constitutional amendment that would bring citizen initiative. So when people say, "What is the first thing you would do?" First thing I would do is tell the General Assembly that they have to pass this constitutional amendment so that it can go to the voters. And if they don't, I'm going to veto 90% of the stuff they send me. They might override that veto, but like that, I think is the kind of way that we have to use post-duopoly politics and post-duopoly power in order to change things. It's like, we're not going to go and do business as usual politics and just be a greener version of a blue governor. We're going to go and we're going to demand that things change. And the first demand for that is that we allow citizen initiative to be here in the state of Maryland, so that people can circumvent the politicians, when the politicians who who run out of gerrymandered districts that are gerrymandered in order to ensure that the Democrats keep a veto-proof majority. We need to change that. We need to give people the initiative, and all of the Democrat counties where all these folks have it at the county level, and so we need to have it at the state level. So absolutely on that. The second thing is, I think these housing first initiatives are super important, because Maryland has the highest rate of evictions of any state in the country, and when you get evicted in a place like where I live in Baltimore, or like where my mom lives in Frederick, well, once you get that eviction in a really hyper competitive rental market, you're not getting another place. And so we end up having people move out of state or move 3-4 hours away, because that's where the rental market is more open. And then, like I said, they don't have access to trains. They may not have a car that can drive 3 hours every day. So now they're stuck in a town where the only jobs are at a prison or at, cleaning a hospital. And so we need to have that. We need to have citizen initiative. We need to have housing first, and we need to do something to stop the landlords from being able to raise the rates and kick people out at will.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of having a state public bank is that it builds infrastructure in order to help. So the building of the infrastructure of, say, more public housing for the people to be able to have. So then, of course, it's not going to be a huge cost to the taxpayers, right? But then at the same time, you're also giving housing to those who are unhoused. And then those people who are unhoused also eventually will get jobs. So then they can start paying more taxes to the state. And so it's a positive cycle that ends up starting. So I think that's, just a wonderful idea. God, I have more questions. Can we do like 10 more minutes?
I'm good as long as you want to go.
Okay. I just want to get to a couple more questions then. I really want to get through this list. So we're going to go to number 6. Thank you very much for being very generous of your time, by the way. Number 6 that we're going to get to is divest from war, exploitation, incarceration, and environmental destruction. Would this include divestment from Israel for their Holocaust against Palestinians? And would you push for or support state divestment and sanctions against Israel? That's the first part of my question.
Yeah, so that's how this came about. When I originally started this campaign, the part of the Israel stuff that we were focused on was overturning the BDS executive order that Republican Governor Larry Hogan signed and Democratic Governor Wes Moore extended. So to 2017, I think, maybe 2018, there was a BDS executive order here that says you can't do any contracting with the state of Maryland if you support boycotting Israel, including its territories, which means that you couldn't even boycott something in the state of Maryland that was occupying a business out of illegal settlements in the West Bank. That would prohibit you. So when we started this campaign, we were going to repeal that, and like that was in 2022. Then in 2023, as it became clear that that was just symbolic compared to the real harm that was going on, we now understand that we need to divest any state of Maryland connection to the state of Israel. And that includes the Maryland Israel Development Consortium or something, which is a public-private partnership between the Maryland Department of Commerce and the government of Israel in order to start businesses here that help Israel. And those are oftentimes technology businesses, security businesses, things like that. So we're immediately cutting that. We're also going to end the collaboration between some of the colleges like the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Tel Aviv University, which have this sort of long-going, cooperation program back and forth between Maryland and Israel. And there's a really good book about this called Towers of Iron and Steel by Maya Wynn, where she talks about how these university connections are a big part of maintaining the sort of liberal institution of Israel. So we're ending that as well. Beyond that, Maryland has a whole bunch of weapons makers that are here and that are getting tax subsidies and that have real political power and real economic power. And we're going to cut ties with those as well, because those folks who are in the war economy here in Maryland are not good for people in Maryland, or not good for people around the world. So we're going to do everything we can to divest from that, and so. Yes, divestment from those things as much as possible. I don't know what level the state of Maryland can sanction Israel or Israelis to the same level as the federal government can. But if there's options for that are working in other states, I'm more than happy to explore them. The Green Party has been about BDS and a free Palestine for 20 years, 25 years. And that and reparations, I think, are two of the things that most distinguish them from the Democratic Party. And so I'm going to push as hard as we can on that. The other thing that I will say on this real quick is that Aruna Miller, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, is an Indian American woman, and there are suggestions that she has connections to Hinduvada and to sort of right-wing Hindu nationalist organizations. What the campaign says on the page is, we didn't take any money from anybody who Joe Biden or Ro Khanna didn't take money from, which might work in a Democratic primary, but doesn't work for me. If we have a lieutenant governor who's supporting Hindu nationalism, especially at a time when India is increasingly threatening Pakistan and Kashmir, then I think we need to be very observant of that too. And so as we start looking at the ways that we have connections to the genocidal government of Israel, we need to also look at ways that we have connections to other anti-Muslim countries around the world, and figure out how to make sure that Maryland is not spending its money, its resources, or its energy sanctioning those things. So yes, absolutely divest from Israel to every degree that we can. In the executive order that stops folks from boycotting, and if there's a way to look at sanctions, I'm all for it.
All right, thank you very much. Now, the second part of my question is, how would you handle the issue of private prisons in the state who require them to be filled to make more money?
Maryland doesn't really use private prisons for the most part. Maryland is okay on that question, but it does use prison industry and our schools. It does use prison work and labor in a lot of places. And I think that's a real problem too. And I think we need to turn our focus there and figure out either how to make sure that if prison labor is being used, that people are being paid a fair and reasonable wage for that, or just stop using prison labor altogether. And I think generally, Maryland has a mass incarceration problem, and it has long had a mass incarceration problem. It has a mass arrest problem. It has an over policing problem, and we need to understand how to wind down this system that Martin O'Malley and a lot of other people helped to put in place in the state, that lock up too many people, that charge too many people, that don't allow people like we have this unit rule here, about expungement. So if you get slapped with a whole bunch of charges, but they drop some of them, you can't easily get rid of the ones that got dropped from your record. You have to get everything expunged together. There is a ton of work to do in the area of criminal justice, because despite being a 30% Black state, despite being a wealthy state, Maryland has solved most of its political problems with mass policing and mass incarceration over the years, and we have to unwind that if we want a future that works for everyone.
All right, thank you very much. And there's a third part to my question, and because you talked about environmental destruction, would you be willing to take a look at thorium-based nuclear power plants?
Sure, we'll take a look at it. Right. So we are subject right now to this multi-state coalition run by fossil fuel companies that is sort of dictating how we do our energy supply, how we do our energy demand, and you combine that with the fact that at the state level we've largely given monopoly power to a few energy companies. They're raising rates. Rates are going to go up again this summer, and it is not working. The current energy setup is not working. So if somebody can show me a plan for some sort of small next generation nuclear reactor or something that can show that it is affordable, that it is safe, and that it can come online in a way that can be community controlled, that can be democratically run, and that we're not giving it to some corporation that is going to jack up the rates and pass everything on to ratepayers, I'm happy to look at it. And so I'm not going to. I think it is essential that Maryland breaks away from control of the fossil fuel companies. And I'm not interested in any form of energy where we just transfer it from one corporation to another corporation. I'm interested in a form of energy where the people of Maryland can democratically control the energy supply. And I'll look at any source that's available if we can do that. But to me, the key thing is getting the power away from the fossil fuel companies and the energy companies that work with the fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, let me just share this article with you. This is actually out of Live Science. It says these Chinese scientists make nuclear power breakthrough using abandoned U.S. research. Scientists in China have refueled a thorium reactor on the fly for the first time. The breakthrough is paving the way for working reactors that are significantly safer than conventional alternatives. This came out in April of this year, and it talks about thorium reactors and how they are much safer than uranium reactors. And so, of course, some people still have, when they hear nuclear, they have a visceral reaction, which is justified given, what, has happened in the past. But thorium seems to be a lot safer and a lot more holistic when it comes to being used as far as power. And one thing I also would also push is that if we were to implement a thorium-based reactor, it would have to be community or state owned,
right,
not owned by any corporation. No public-private partnerships. It's
right,
only public. I would be kind of like the Tennessee Valley Authority, where it's only owned by the people and ran by the people. So therefore, their energy costs will be lower because it's not subject to profit, as well as any money that is garnered for it would be for maintenance and for emergency funds and things like that, so that they can continue to run, and also it being such a much lower cost to the people, both environmentally and also fiscally, then that also would be kind of an influx of cash towards the taxpayers of Maryland as well.
Totally. And look, any energy source we use, we need to understand its cost, how long it's going to take to get online, and what the risks, what the environmental and pollution risks of it are. But the most important thing is that we move away from trying to beg the corporations to give us a good rate and figure out how to take control of our power supply so that we, the people, can determine how it runs, how it works. And if that includes nuclear and somebody can prove, and make the case for it being safe, costly, or cost efficient and timely, great. I'm more than happy to listen to that.
Okay. So let me get to this final. I just want to ask one more question and then I'll just leave it there because, of course, you've been very respectful. You've been very generous with your time. And so I just want to thank you for that. But the final question that I will like to ask is, let me see here. Make sure I go back to my notes. And so this would be invest in community institutions that can address the root causes of crime. So what method would this entail, and would this mean divestment from traditional police and reinvestment into underserved communities? What specifically would this look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly is. It certainly is less money in policing. It is more money in community-based violence interruption. It is more money in community-based programs and things like that. So one of the things that I mentioned was the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund at the beginning. And one of the goals of the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund is to go around the foundations and the, sort of university foundation nonprofit best practice complex and figure out what things are working in the communities where crime is a problem, and figure out how to get resources to those folks. So if there is a grassroots group of folks that are doing violence interruption, I would much rather figure out what kind of resources those folks need than give some university foundation funded program that has a flashy website and a nice deck of how they have best practices and things like that. I'd much rather give the organization doing the work on the ground with the track record, the resources they need to scale up their work, than give some, nonprofit professional with good foundation and university connections the contract. I think there's a really good way of looking at sort of the Newark model of that in some senses, where Newark is using a lot of community-based programs, a lot of violence interruption, a lot of these type of things. I think most of the places where crime is a problem have people in those communities who know what to do in order to take care of kids and know what to do in order to bring about community repair, know what to do to bring about rehabilitation, have different ways of addressing drug use and mental health problems than the social science establishment would say. And I think we need to get resources to those folks. The people who are doing the work know what they're doing, and we shouldn't be afraid, even if they don't have the grant writer who can explain exactly why they hit every point on the metric or something like that. If they can prove that they've been doing the work, we should make sure that resources flow to them. Now, I'm not saying that some of the foundations, some of the university funded, some of the nonprofit things aren't good, but as long as we let them define what this stuff looks like, then we're gonna get stuff that shuts out the people who have the answers and are doing the work right now in communities and have been doing it for decades.
All right. Thank you very much for that nuanced answer. Look, I just want to thank you. I was able to get 8 out of 10 of my questions for this one. So I feel like that is a victory. That's a huge victory. Thank you so very much for joining me. So if you can let people know where they can find you, your website, which I've already put in the description as well as in the chat, but if you can know what you have coming up next as well.
Yeah. Sure. So thank you so much. This is an awesome conversation. It went by really quick. I'm sorry I spoke for so long on some of these answers and we didn't get to all 10 of your questions, but people can check us out at gogreen2026.com. I think it's the same on X. It's the same on Facebook. I think on IG it's Go Green Maryland or something like that. But all of that is available from the website. There's a link for you there. You can do all of that stuff. Then June 14th, we have the Maryland Green Party annual assembly, and it is the 25th annual Maryland Green Party assembly. Most third parties in the United States don't last 4 or 5 years. We've lasted 25 years, and we're really proud of that. We want to celebrate the past 25 years, keeping, being on the ballot for all that time, and look forward to the next 25 years. And then I also wanted to say next, coming up pretty soon, there's going to be some more information coming out. This weekend, we're going to start a campaign newsletter called Theory of Change. And with that, we're going to try to explain the questions that everybody has. Like, hey, Andy, I like all the ideas you had today. How does running as a third party candidate help us to get to those ideas? So that's going to be the venue where we talk about all that stuff. We talk about how third party politics work with the theory, with the history and the practice. And then coming up later in July, we'll be releasing our plan for a solidarity economy. This has public banks, this has co-ops, this has progressive taxation, this has public ownership. We think that this is a vision of what Maryland can look like 10 years from now. Now that the federal government, the Trump administration has cut the federal jobs, which have been our lifeline out. We need to think about what we do to build a Maryland that works for everyone 10 years from now. And that solidarity economy plan will be coming out very soon. And then we'll have some other stuff coming out later in the summer about what it looks like to have a grassroots democracy plan. We really believe that now is the time to talk about how to transform Maryland, how to think about the Maryland we want for a decade from now, and how to start working for it. And that's really what this is all about. The policy parts of it are important, but in order to get the policy parts of it, we have to have a method of activating people and activating a movement in order to push for these type of things. And we have to have a vision of what a different kind of state looks like. So we're working on all of that stuff. I'm always happy to come on and talk about any of those things, but I so appreciate the opportunity to run down the list today, talk to you and your listeners about all this stuff, you and your viewers, and just engage this awesome conversation. I love a policy conversation on the left outside of the duopoly, and just really appreciate you making the space for having it today.
Thank you so very much for coming on. It was definitely a pleasure and an honor to have you. Look, everybody, Andy Ellis for Governor of Maryland. Thank you so very much for joining me, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Jaybefaunt. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah. Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.